In this time of social distancing and isolation, we are probably all of us feeling the weight of it all. Uh, it's getting exhausting. It's getting tiring, and perhaps even in our workspaces, it's beginning to become exhausting and redundant. There's a level of sense of you want to get back to the office. Some of you are going to the office and who are going to work on a regular basis. Thank you so much for committing. For those essential workers who are listening, thank you for committing to work in this way. As I've mentioned before, for those of you who are in the medical field, thank you. You are really the heroes here in all of this, and so thank you for serving us in this way. But you think about work in this moment. It's really hard to maintain a level of rigor and demand as differently than what you were working prior. The level of accountability is really different now, isn't it? We certainly have deadlines, but to continue on without having a firm schedule or an office or a desk at home, it seems really hard. It seems that, for those of us who are parents, to do parenting, to do work, those things are kind of the line now is now distant and far. And so we all can't wait to get to a level of normalcy when we get back to work, right? Well, it seems as though that's kind of the passage, what we're talking about this morning. The passage is speaking about this idea of waiting and working and accountability while we wait to get back to a place of normalcy. But Jesus now shifts his emphasis from worrying about the present world. That is, in Luke chapter 12, he's been talking about the need not to worry about finances, about our possessions, not to be like hypocrites there, but to actually be people who are now anticipating a future. He wants to focus his disciples on the reality that Jesus is returning, that one day he's coming back and going to get his children back. And so this idea here that Jesus is trying to emphasize is that for those of them who have a future tense living, they will be ready. They will anticipate this arrival of him in this passage. And so this passage is addressing the subject of the Lord's return. It is seeking to answer the question, how are we to wait for Jesus's return? In other words, what Jesus is sort of trying to answer in this passage by giving these two parables is, how are we to remain faithful as we wait for the Lord's second return? You see, it's not about defending the fact that Jesus will return. This passage assumes that Jesus will in fact return, that he will come back, and the disciples are called to live in a specific way, and those who are managing and leading are called to live in a specific way as well. We're going to see really three things that the disciples are essentially to anticipate, they are to remain awake, and they are to be apprised about these particular things. They are to wait, they are to watch, and to be warned about these particular realities that the Lord himself will come. In verses 35 to 36, they are to anticipate. And again, Jesus here is he's addressing that if faithful servants, that if they're to recognize that Jesus is returning, they are to anticipate his return. And anticipate then is tied to waiting. Notice what they're called to do there in verse 35. They were to stay dressed for action and to keep your lamp burning there in verse 35. There's an aspect of they were to be prepared about Jesus' return. It means that they were to stay ready. They were to be active for duty. Think about someone who is who has to wear a uniform to get to work or to be at work. They are to stay dressed as they take off on this active duty. When they take off their clothes, they're not on active duty. For instance, like a police officer or a fireman, but on duty they are to stay dressed in this way. When Jesus is liking that here of his return, that they were to be prepared by being dressed. Secondly, they're also to think about this idea of maintaining. As they're waiting for the Lord's return, as they anticipate his return, not only were they to be dressed, but they were to have their lamps. It says their lamps are to keep their lamps burning, which has a sort of awareness of maintaining, that they were to be active, that they were essentially to have their quote unquote batteries charged. For those of you who drive electric cars, you can't go anywhere without having your car fully charged. Or for us who have our phones all over all the time, we all have our phones, and we always plan to prepare to charge our phones overnight so that we can have full use during the day. And so it's about the essence of maintaining here. It's about keeping this and preserving an aspect of waiting for the Lord to keep our lamps burned there in verse 35. But then also they are to live, as relates to this idea of anticipating the Lord's return. They were to be prepared, they were to maintain, but also they were to have this level of expectation. Verse 36, it says, they were to be like men waiting for their masters. They were to be waiting for their masters. That's a level of expectation. Jesus, again, is returning. It's not so much the debate about whether or not he's going to return. He is going to return. And Jesus is likened here in this parable as the master. And they are the servants waiting upon his return. So there's a level of expectation here. Jesus will come back. And then fourthly, on this idea of anticipation, they were to anticipate, but also understanding they were to engage in the work. Look at verse 36 again. They were to come home from the feast when the master comes home, so that they may open the door to him at once when he comes and he knocks. You see, they were to engage in particular work. They were to anticipate the fact that they were going to do work when Jesus comes back. They were to prepare, they were to maintain, anticipate a level of maintenance. They were to recognize that they were to live in expectancy, and then they were to engage in this way. That's really what it means to actually recognize that Jesus himself will come back. How was it that they were to live? They were to anticipate the fact that Jesus was going to return. But secondly, look at how the passage shifts. In verses 37 to 40, it shifts by recognizing that faithful servants are to remain awake for Christ's return. And if the first section dealt with anticipation is tied with waiting, this one is blessedness is tied with being awake. That there's a word of blessing in this section here. Notice in verse 37 said blessedness is tied through to this idea of being awake. Again, verse 37, blessed are those servants whom the master finds awake. And notice again, verse 38, it's associated, even the word there, the sentence there, the construction there, it has awake tied with this idea of blessedness in verse 38. If he comes the second watch or the third watch, he finds them awake, blessed are those servants. And so what we find here is that this one, Jesus is now giving a blessing to those individuals who will stay awake as they're watching for the return of Jesus. But notice also there's a level and there's a word of urgency in verse 39. There's a word of blessing and there's a word of urgency, almost a word of warning in verse 39. And it comes with, in verse 39, with the conjunction there. But know this, that if a master of the house had known at the hour the thief was coming, he would not have left his house to be broken into. You see, at this word here in verse 39, Jesus introduces the idea of a thief. Servants are to stay awake. But notice that their work was to be done with a level of seriousness, because there's something at stake here. That they were to stay awake as they were waiting for the return of their master, because there's some urgency, there's some seriousness, there's a level of recognizing that there's a potential thief that could lurk about and ready to break in and to steal. And so Jesus is calling his disciples to be ready upon his return, that he's demanding a sense of urgency and earnestness in the way in which they were to care for the things about as they were waiting for his return. Again, Jesus is recognizing that there's a level of urgency here, that their work was to be done with seriousness. They couldn't just fool around as they were waiting as servants in this way. And again, we're talking about the picture here is there in first century Palestine of a wedding feast, and servants were waiting as they were waiting for the bridegroom to come back and to anticipate this wonderful celebration. They were to stay awake in this passage here. So Jesus tells them to be awake. He demands a level of urgency because of this potential impending thief that's going to come. And the fact that, and it's associated to this fact that they don't know when a thief is coming. And that's what Jesus is likening to. His return is going to be like a thief. No one knows when a thief is ready to break in. And so he says to them in verse 40, at the end of this section here, you must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. And so Jesus here is saying, listen, I will return, and you're to live in such a way that anticipates my return, but you're to live in such a way that stays alert or stays awake. That's what you're called to do, because you don't know when I'm coming back, is what Jesus tells his disciples there in this section in verses 35 to 40. But then in verses 41 to 48, Jesus shares another parable with his disciples. And he shares this parable in order to give us level of clarity as to what he's just said. And the second parable comes at the prompting of Peter's question there in verse 41. You see, Peter is asking, and he's saying, Lord, are you telling this parable for us or for all? Again, we know at the beginning of chapter 12 that there's a massive crowd that's situated there with Jesus. The crowd was so big that even people were trampling over each other just to get close to Jesus. But now Peter's saying, are you just telling that to us? Or is it to everyone? And so Jesus now will clarify that by giving them a second parable in this level. Jesus will now clarify. And he says that a faithful servant is one who apprises the fact that Jesus is going to return. Essentially, it's a warning. It gives greater warning, because we see the word or the language here is now of people being chopped up, serpents being beaten. I mean, there's a level of seriousness and warning here in this section, verses 41. And this one is tied to the fact that faithfulness is tied now to stewardship. Essentially, he's now talking to the fact that of how you steward your responsibility while you wait for the Lord's return. Faithfulness is actually going to come out of, and it's tied and it's wedded to this idea of being stewards in this way. And so notice here the context of what Jesus is addressing. The context is he's addressing managers. The first parable was dealing with servants and waiting for their masters. Now it's dealing for those who are supervisor, who are managers, who are over servants. And so I would say that given the context of this passage here in chapter 12, we know that Jesus has already addressed the Pharisees and the lawyers in chapter 11, verse 53. Notice what he says there in chapter 11, verse 53. As he went away from there, the scribes and the Pharisees began to press him hard and to provoke him to speak about many things, lying in wait for him to catch him in something that he might say. So the context is those who are managers, those who are leaders of the religious system, the religious authority, those are the Pharisees, those are the scribes. We know in chapter 12, verse 2 as well, that Jesus is addressing, and he's already told the disciples or the crowds there that were trampling to get close to him, Jesus said, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, the hypocrites. So Jesus is already dressed, and now he's now sort of pointing and pressing in on this parable and narrowing it down. He's saying those managers. So I think the context of this passage is actually speaking to those Pharisees, those who have a tendency to have hypocritical tendencies in this way, those who are religious leaders who give great commands, but their own personal life, they're living far away from it. So these verses indicate that Jesus was talking primarily about the religious leadership of the nation of that time. The religious leaders were supposed to manage the nation for God until he brought in the kingdom of God. But they failed at their task, and they were not looking for the expectancy of Jesus' return or the Lord's kingdom at that moment. And so from this parable, the managers had portion, they had possessions. And notice, this is what's really interesting about this idea of possessions there. The context is one that's filled with possessions. In verse 44, it says that take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist of the abundance of his possessions. Jesus is already pushing. He's already pushing against the status quo. He's now saying that baseline stuff that the Pharisees have addressed. We got to live differently from those who love their possessions in this way. Notice also in verse 33, he's already addressed his idea to the idea of the potential idols that are laden within disciples. So he gives this warning, and he gives us an instruction in verse 33: sell all your possessions and give to the needy. The very thing that the Pharisees and the scribes and the lawyers were unable to do. They had so much, but they squandered it, or they actually were not able and willing to give it up. And notice here in verse 43 here that there is a blessing in verse 43. There's a blessing for those who are faithful managers. Jesus gives this warning or this word to managers, but he's also giving this idea that blessed are the servants, is the servant, verse 43, whom his master will find so doing when he comes. Who's the blessed one? The blessed manager is someone who works really hard, who manages well, who stays awake, who is fair to his workers, who is kind to those that he's working around, that he's kind to his neighbors in this way. There's blessing there in verse 43. But in verse 45, Jesus shares a warning, and this warning is very firm. It's the thing that the disciples had to be apprised about. They had to know and be warned that unfaithfulness and those who squandered their religious authority, they will be severely judged. And notice what they do. They beat their servants. They put unfair laws against those that are under them, laws that they themselves can't even keep. And they beat them. It says there in the passage there, it says that they beat them and they hurt them, their servants, in this way. But if the servant, verse 45, says to himself, my master is delayed in coming, and he begins to beat his male and female servants, and to eat and drink and to get drunk, he will be judged. And so for this servant here, for this master here, who says, I can kick my feet up, I can lay back at my desk, I can squander my responsibility, and I can be really harsh to those that are under me. And notice the progression there: to eat, drink, and get drunk. It's really the same words that we saw in the previous section related to the individual who builds his barns, and he says to himself in verse 19, he will relax, eat, drink, and be merry. You see the way Jesus is now tying all of his instructions, and now he's giving word pictures. He's embodying all his instructions that he said previously before this section, and now he's giving those parables. And because he's honing in and pressing in the fact that those Pharisees and scribes who hated Jesus, he's now speaking against them and causing the disciples to be warned about this reality. The disciples were to be apprised about the unfaithfulness and the fact that squandering, it could be a tendency related to this authority. So Jesus tells them about the way the managers took advantage over servants. They essentially squandered their privilege. They didn't pay attention to the potential consequences that were there. So see, Jesus summarizes the curse and the blessing of faithfulness and faithlessness in verse 47 and verse 48. Notice what he says there in verse 47. And that servant who knew his master's will, but did not get ready or act according to his will receive a severe beating. But the one who did not know and did not deserve a beating will receive light beating. And everyone to whom was given of him much will be required. And from him to whom they entrust much, they will be demanded more. You see, Jesus here gives this and concludes his teaching by implying the reality that people will be held accountable. People will be held accountable. So as we wait, Jesus says, as you wait, and for those of you who have responsibility and authority, do not squander it. Do not be unfoolish. Do not think that you can sit back and squander your responsibility. No, you will be held accountable to this great standard as you wait and as you anticipate his return. Now we know that accountability, as I mentioned earlier, accountability with employment, with your employers presently during this time of COVID-19, this stay-at-home shelter, accountability is really hard, and it's hard to maintain. But it could perhaps, the way in which we do our work presently with our employers, it could perhaps be a microcosm of a picture of the way in which we anticipate the arrival and the return of Jesus. I think those are tied there and connected in this way. Jesus is calling us to recognize that his return is imminent, and he demands his children, his disciples, to be ready and to have to have an eagerness in the way in which they wait for him. So let us, I think the aim of the passage here is that we are to remain faithful to Christ and to be ready for his return. We've seen this passage here call us to anticipate the Master's return. It's called us to stay awake for Jesus' return, and it's called us to really and seriously be apprised about Jesus' return. We are to anticipate that ties to this idea of waiting. We are to have this blessedness, to recognize that there's blessedness, and it's a tied to the way in which we are faithful. And we are to be faithful because it's tied to the level of our steward, the way in which we steward our possessions and our responsibility. And so may we be a church that recognizes that in the power of the Holy Spirit, because of Christ's good work on the cross and in the resurrection, we now have the Spirit, and now we can stay awake, we can be alert, we can anticipate the return of Christ. And so may we be ready. May we gird up our loins. May we stay dressed. May we firmly be fixed on Christ as he returns. And as he returns, may we be found faithful